Welcome to the store. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me.
The world had never felt so quiet. President Carter stood at the edge of the White House balcony, staring out at a Washington, D.C., that was nothing more than a husk of its former self. The once bustling streets, always alive with chatter, car horns, and protests, had fallen silent. The only sounds now were the occasional hums from the quantum generators set up throughout the city. They were the last hope of an entire species, a lifeline made of equations and the brilliance of Dr. Elena Vargas. The sky was a smudged gray, a fitting backdrop for the end of the world. The sun hadn't been seen in months, its rays obscured by a thick layer of pollutants and ash. Earth's final breath was coming. Everyone knew it, but they were too scared to say it aloud. Carter's fingers tightened around the railing as his thoughts turned to the decision that lay ahead. No leader should ever have to make this kind of choice, he thought. But then again, no leader had ever faced the end of humanity like this. Behind him, the sliding glass door clicked open. The familiar footsteps of Dr. Vargas echoed faintly on the marble floor. "You should rest, Mr. President," Elena said softly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who hadn't slept in days. "You've been out here for hours." Carter turned, his expression unreadable. "You know I can't rest, Elena. Not now." She stepped closer, her brown eyes betraying the exhaustion her face fought to hide. "We've run the simulations 100 times. It will work. The quantum transfer is ready." "It doesn't matter if it works," Carter replied, his voice rough. "The question is whether I'm ready to go through with it." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had been so focused on the technicalities of the transfer, calculating energy outputs, stabilizing quantum fields, that she hadn't allowed herself to truly think about the human cost. The decision that would save billions required the life of one man. The life of the man standing before her. "We don't have another option," she said after a moment, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "The transfer requires an energy source strong enough to bridge the quantum divide. Nothing else on Earth can provide that much power." "Nothing except me," Carter finished for her. He ran a hand through his graying hair. "Just me." The words hung heavy in the air between them, their truth undeniable. In all her brilliance, Dr. Vargas had created a way to save humanity, but at a price neither of them had anticipated when they first embarked on this desperate mission. The energy needed to initiate the quantum transfer could only come from a human being, and that human had to be someone with a unique biological signature. After months of tests and analysis, they had concluded that the only viable candidate was President Carter himself. "There's still time to reconsider," Elena said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "Maybe there's another way." There is no other way," Carter interrupted. His eyes, once kind and calm, now burned with the weight of 1,000 burdens. "I've made my decision." Elena closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to breathe through the guilt clawing at her chest. She had spent her entire life working on quantum mechanics, dreaming of the possibilities that alternate universes could offer. But she had never wanted her work to cost someone their life, especially not the life of a man like President Carter. "We'll begin preparations," she said, her voice breaking ever so slightly. "We'll be ready when you are." Carter nodded but didn't speak. He turned back to the railing, his gaze once again fixed on the barren streets below. Elena left the balcony in silence. The announcement came the next day, broadcast to every remaining screen in the world. Carter's face filled the empty living rooms of billions. He looked tired, but resolute. The weight of his decision had carved deep lines into his face, but there was a quiet strength in his eyes. "My fellow citizens," he began, the familiar cadence of his voice soothing despite the gravity of his words. We stand at the end of a long and painful journey. Earth, our home, is dying. Our resources have been depleted, our environment has collapsed, and our people have suffered. But there is hope. He paused, letting the words settle into the hearts of those watching. Thanks to the brilliance of our scientists, we have discovered a way to transfer humanity to another universe, one rich in resources and opportunity. A second chance for all of us. The cameras pan to images of the quantum generators humming quietly in the background. The transfer centers, vast facilities constructed around the globe, stood ready to receive the world's population. It was all very orderly, very clinical. But the cameras couldn't capture the tension, the fear that lingered in the air like smoke. There is, however, a cost, Carter continued, his voice softening. The energy required to initiate the transfer is immense, far more than any machine or device on Earth can produce. But there is one source of energy that is powerful enough: human life. A ripple of confusion and unease spread through the global audience. The president took a deep breath, his next words laced with finality. "The only viable candidate is me." Gasps echoed in homes and streets. Faces turned pale. The president, the man they had looked to for guidance and strength through these dark times, was telling them that he would sacrifice himself. "The decision has not been made lightly," Carter continued. "I know the burden this places on all of us. But I believe in humanity's future. I believe in our ability to survive and thrive in a new world. This is my choice. And I make it willingly." Tears welled up in the eyes of many who watched, but Carter's face remained resolute. "This is not an end," he said, his voice rising with strength. "This is the beginning of a new chapter for our species. A new home. A new future. For you. For your children. For all of us." He paused, his gaze piercing through the screen, as though he could look into the soul of every individual watching. "I ask only that you honor this sacrifice by living. By rebuilding. By creating a future that is worthy of the lives we've lost." The screen went dark, leaving the world in stunned silence. 2 days passed, and preparations began for the quantum transfer. Around the world, citizens filed into the transfer centers, eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. These centers had been constructed at breakneck speed once Dr. Vargas had announced her breakthrough. They were massive, domed structures, with towering antennae designed to harness the quantum fields and channel the energy needed for the transfer. They looked like something out of a science fiction novel, but they were humanity's last hope. Dr. Vargas stood at the command center in New York, overseeing the final tests on the equipment. Her team of engineers and quantum physicists worked in silence, the only sound the hum of the machines. The pressure was unbearable, but no one said a word. There was no room for error. The transfer process itself was as much a mystery to her as it was a marvel. The theory was sound, and the simulations had shown success. But this had never been done on such a scale. Billions of lives hung in the balance, and the only thing powering the entire process was the life of one man. Elena's fingers tightened on the edge of the control panel. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. Everything had to go perfectly. There was no margin for error. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind her. "He's here." Elena turned to see one of her assistants standing in the doorway, his face pale. President Carter had arrived. President Carter stepped into the command center, his face pale but determined. He was flanked by 2 Secret Service agents, though their presence felt more ceremonial than protective at this point. No one could protect him from what was coming, and he had accepted that. Elena straightened, her eyes locking with his. For a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. "Mr. President," she greeted him softly, gesturing toward the quantum nexus, a large chamber at the center of the facility where the transfer would take place. Its polished metal walls gleamed under the sterile lighting, the machinery surrounding it humming with a quiet, terrifying power. The nexus was the heart of the operation, the place where Carter would give his final gift to humanity. "Dr. Vargas," Carter replied, his voice steady. "I trust everything is ready?" Elena nodded, though the motion felt heavy. "We've run all the final tests. The system is stable, and we're prepared to begin the transfer when you are." Carter gave a small nod and glanced around the room, at the faces of the men and women who had worked tirelessly for months to make this possible. He could see the weight of responsibility etched into their expressions, the guilt they carried, knowing what this required. He didn't blame them. If anything, he admired their courage for continuing despite the awful truth of it all. He turned to Elena. "There's no need to delay any longer." Her stomach twisted, but she simply nodded, walking with him toward the nexus. The door slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing the interior of the chamber. Inside, it was stark and cold, devoid of any comfort or warmth. A single platform awaited him at the center, surrounded by thick cables that would channel the energy from his body into the quantum network. Carter stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the metallic space. He paused at the platform, taking one last look around. The world outside this chamber might be saved, but his world was ending here. He thought of his children, of his wife, of the life he'd led. A life full of difficult decisions, but none more difficult than this. He had always believed in sacrifice for the greater good, but now, standing on the precipice of oblivion, the finality of it hit him like a tidal wave. Elena approached the door of the nexus, her hand hovering over the control panel. "Mr. President, are you sure?" "I'm sure," Carter interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Please, just do it." She bit her lip and pressed the button. The door slid shut with a soft hiss, sealing him inside. For a moment, the room felt unbearably silent. Elena forced herself to breathe, her hand trembling as she activated the final sequence. On the screen before her, the system's interface glowed to life, displaying rows of data that were both beautiful and terrifying in their precision. A countdown appeared. 10 minutes. It wasn't long, but it felt like a lifetime. Inside the nexus, Carter stood on the platform, feeling the faint hum of energy vibrating through the walls. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of peace. There was nothing left to fear. This was his choice. He had made it willingly. And in the end, wasn't that all anyone could hope for? The chance to choose their destiny. The hum grew louder. The transfer process was beginning. He could feel the energy building, pulling at him, tugging at his very molecules. It wasn't painful, not yet, but there was a sensation, an awareness that his body was no longer just his own. He was becoming part of something larger, something infinite. Outside, Elena watched the data streams, her heart pounding as the energy levels rose to critical. The generators were humming now, vibrating with the sheer force of the quantum fields being activated. On the screens around her, live feeds from the transfer centers across the world showed crowds of people waiting, their faces filled with a mixture of hope and fear. The timer ticked down. 5 minutes. Inside the nexus, Carter felt a sharp pull, and his breath hitched. His body was starting to unravel, the energy within him being converted into raw quantum power. He could feel it coursing through him, crackling in his veins. It wasn't painful, but it was disorienting, like standing on the edge of a storm and feeling the wind begin to tear you apart. He gritted his teeth, holding on to the last remnants of his consciousness, willing himself to stay present, for them, he thought. For all of them, the countdown reached 2 minutes. Elena's hands hovered over the controls, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The energy levels were off the charts now, the nexus glowing with an otherworldly light. She could feel the electricity in the air, the raw power radiating from the chamber. It was terrifying and awe-inspiring all at once, and then, with 1 minute remaining, something shifted. A wave of energy rippled through the nexus, and Carter gasped as the quantum fields enveloped him completely. His vision blurred, the world around him dissolving into a sea of light and sound. He could feel himself being pulled apart, piece by piece, his very essence being transformed into energy. This is it, he realized. This is the end. But even as his body disintegrated, a strange calm settled over him. He was no longer afraid. He had made his choice, and it was the right one. For his children. For his people. For humanity. And then, just as the final seconds ticked away, he whispered into the void, "Live well." The nexus pulsed with a blinding light, and Carter was gone. Elena stood frozen, her eyes locked on the screen as the energy levels spiked and then stabilized. It was done. The quantum transfer had begun. Around her, the room was silent, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on everyone. No one spoke. No one moved. On the screens, the transfer centers around the world were coming to life. People were being swept into the quantum fields, their bodies dissolving into energy as they were transported to the new universe. It was happening. Humanity was being saved, but at what cost? Elena's breath hitched, and she turned away from the screen, unable to watch any longer. She had done what needed to be done, but the guilt was overwhelming. She had taken a life, a good man's life, to save billions. And now, she would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of her days, but there was no time for regrets. The world was moving forward, and she had to move with it. The transfer process continued for hours, the quantum fields working tirelessly to move the entire population of Earth into the new universe. It was an immense undertaking, but the system held. Dr. Vargas monitored the process from the control room, her eyes flicking between the screens as the final few groups were transported, and then, just as the last transfer was completed, the nexus went dark. It was over. Elena slumped into her chair, exhaustion finally catching up with her. The world, the old world, was gone. And somewhere, in a universe far beyond her understanding, humanity was beginning anew. She closed her eyes, her mind racing with the possibilities. There was no way of knowing what awaited them in this new universe. It could be a paradise, or it could be a new hell. But whatever it was, they would face it together. They would rebuild. They would survive, and they would remember the man who made it all possible. The new world was beautiful. Lush, green landscapes stretched out as far as the eye could see, with rolling hills and clear blue skies. The air was crisp, free from the choking smog of Earth. The people, disoriented and dazed from the transfer, blinked up at the unfamiliar sky, their eyes wide with a it was paradise. Elena stood among them, taking it all in. It was hard to believe that they had made it, that they had survived. But here they were, standing on the soil of a new world, ready to begin again. It was a miracle, born of sacrifice and science. A small smile tugged at the corners of her lips as she thought of Carter. His legacy would live on in this place, in every tree, every river, every life that flourished here. He had given them a future, and they would make it a good one. The people began to move, exploring their new home with tentative steps. Elena watched them for a moment longer before turning to leave. There was work to be done, cities to build, governments to form, a society to rebuild from the ashes of the old world. As she walked away, she glanced up at the sky one last time, her heart full of hope. For the first time in a long while, the future seemed bright.